Okay, so welcome everyone to St. John's on behalf of the Holy Land Committee and our church, of course. I'm Kurt Campbell, and along with Nancy Adams, I'm the co-chair of the Holy Land Committee. This is the last adult forum we're having this year, and for the Holy Land Committee, it's also kind of the capstone of a three-part series we started in May. In May, we had a group of speakers from NGOs that we support and work with, and that included Rowan Oda of New Story Leadership, Salim Zaru of United Palestinian Appeal, and John Lent of American Friends of the Episcopal Diocese of Jerusalem. Then in our second part of that series, we had Jonathan Kutab speak about his book, Beyond the Two-State Solution. And today we're having Jon Berger talk. He's someone that many from St. John's know or familiar with because of pilgrimages that Sari took people on from 2014 to 2018. So Jonathan's going to talk about his experience serving in Israel and about U.S. policy towards Israel and Palestine. Jonathan currently is the Foreign Policy Advisor for the Marine Corps element at Special Operations Command, but from 2013 to 2020, he served at the U.S. Embassy in Israel. First, from 2013 to 2016, he was the Foreign Policy Advisor at the Embassy, and in that capacity, he was responsible for monitoring and tracking peace process issues, Palestinian affairs, domestic Israeli politics, and political military issues. And then from 2016 to 2020, he was the cultural attaché in the public diplomacy section of the embassy. And there he was responsible for all official American cultural programming, educational and professional education programs, English language programs, and general outreach to all sectors of the Israeli public. But he has a foreign policy career that started in 2002. He served from 2002 until 2013 in various embassies in Europe, beginning in Copenhagen and then in Belgrade. Later he served at the European Bureau of State Department and at the U.S. Embassy in Vilnius, all before he went to Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And then before joining the State Department, Jonathan also worked for almost 8 years in the U.S. Congress. He served then focusing on Middle East issues, first for Representative Gary Ackerman of New York, and then working on domestic policy issues for Senator Jack Reed of Rhode Island. Jonathan's a graduate of Occidental College in Los Angeles with a BA in Middle Eastern Studies. And he also spent a year abroad at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He speaks Serbian, Lithuanian, and Hebrew. And he's married to Liz Berger, and they have two girls, Lillian and Eve. So now I'd like to turn it over to Jonathan for his remarks, and then Barbara will moderate the question and answer session afterward.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Kirk. Thanks for that really nice comprehensive introduction, and thanks to everybody too for being here. It's an honor. It's a delight for me to talk to the congregation again. As Kirk mentioned, I think this is probably maybe the fourth or fifth time because I also had the pleasure of being over at Ann Dursey's house and for an informal chat. So I feel like we have a long-standing relationship, and I'm really happy about that. Thanks to everybody on the, from Ann Dursey and others on the committee that have arranged this. And again, I'm looking forward to the discussion. I'll keep my remarks relatively brief. I want to obviously go over some important issues. I was going to kind of construct it sort of, looking a little bit in the past, what's happening now, and maybe looking forward, and then really interested in hearing from all of you. I want to say that everything is on the table in terms of what we can discuss, and I'll try to be as candid as I can, and where I can't answer a question because I am still an active State Department employee, then I'll be honest about that. Okay, so as I said, I've spoken with many of you before in the past. I won't, rehash a lot of the history in too great detail. But just to mention that, when I arrived in 2013, in the summer of 2013, it was it's sort of like we were kind of heralding a new beginning. We thought we had gotten the two parties, the Palestinians and Israelis, back to the negotiating table, thanks to the efforts of Secretary Kerry and many others, but especially Secretary Kerry and Ambassador Martin Indyk, who was a former two-time ambassador to Israel and a former Assistant Secretary of State for the Near East, was the special envoy. And because my job was what was called the peace process officer, so I was his essentially his bridge to the embassy, his liaison. And that's what I did for the first 9 months or so of my tenure in Israel. That was a pretty rocky 9 months. It feels like ancient history at this point, but at the time when it began, we really did believe that there was some hope for first a framework going forward into deeper negotiations, and then finally getting to the resolution that we all had hoped for, a two-state solution. That didn't work out as we had hoped, obviously, and following that, the Obama administration essentially pulled back and made a real distinct decision to not engage as fully as it had in the past. For good or bad, this came from President Obama himself, who said, the parties, clearly, I feel like this is a cliche now, but the parties need to want it more than we do, meaning the United States or the international community. And that was clearly not the case. And there were several underlying reasons, and I've talked about this before, and we can discuss it again, why those talks really failed the way that they did, and why it's been so difficult to get the parties back to a position where they can get to the table, not just get to the table, but actually trust each other to be at the table and to have dialogue. We're still very, very far apart in that sense. So then step forward into the next administration, the Trump administration. There's Ambassador Dorsey will back me up on this. There's sort of this maxim in American government that foreign policy doesn't change all that much between administration to administration, Democrat, Republican, and so on. I think, like a lot of things in the Trump administration, that was sort of bent quite a bit. The foreign policy, especially towards our policy towards the Middle East, changed pretty significantly. And again, we don't have to rehash everything in great detail, but the new ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, came with a real set of accomplishments that goals that he wanted to achieve. And he set out very, I would say, pretty aggressively to do that. And he did that also without really any kind of support from the embassy. And I don't mean that there was resistance from the embassy. What I mean is that he was acting quite alone. He had a senior advisor that he had handpicked that he brought with him, and he was working directly with people in the White House, namely Jared Kushner and Jason Greenblatt, who is our special representative for international negotiations. And Jared Kushner was sort of the self-named sort of head of Middle East peace negotiations. And that small group essentially were the ones that were working these changes in policy, without a lot of it without the knowledge of us folks, the career folks at the embassy or even back at the State Department. And what I've told other people is, whether you agree or disagree, the rapidity of the changes that he was able to institute is it's pretty remarkable. In the 3 years or so, 3.5 years that he was ambassador, you can just sort of tick off the things, right? He got the U.S. to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. He got the U.S. to recognize the Golan Heights as part of Israel. He moved the U.S. embassy. And we can talk about that, what that actually means, because, and I usually use air quotes when I say move, because we didn't actually pick up and move. It's a little bit more complicated than that. Again, I can go into that later. But he did establish the U.S. embassy in Jerusalem. And then not long after that, combined the U.S. Consulate General in Jerusalem, which had been an independent mission, not subservient to the embassy, an independent mission in Jerusalem since about 1845. So one of the oldest missions, foreign missions in the world to be in Israel, in the Holy Land, and that was sort of integrated into the embassy. And as you can imagine, there was a lot of difficulties in trying to do that. But once that was done, we actually had kind of a super embassy, super in size, about 1,400 people total, maybe a little bit more than that, which is pretty enormous considering the size of the country it was representing. He, like I said, he set out, to tick off a bunch of boxes, and he managed, and I don't mean to be flip by saying that, but that really was his intention, which he didn't communicate with anybody, but it became clear as we were going through it, and he accomplished it. He accomplished just about every single thing that he set out to do. The last, final thing, I believe, that he wanted to accomplish, or to help Israel accomplish, was annexation of the West Bank, or at least of Area C. So now we're getting into a little bit more recent history, because this was just in sort of getting into the summer of 2020, when this was kind of bubbling to the surface. And there was a lot of talk in the media about whether there was disagreements between Ambassador Friedman, who wanted to push forward with this, and Jared Kushner, who wanted to hold back on this. Not a lot of discussion of where the State Department was, because you might notice I'm not talking about the State Department in any of this, because really we were, whether it was under Rex Tillerson initially, or even Mike Pompeo, who was much more supportive of these moves. The State Department was just not a player in any of this. So it was around, I guess, June or so of 2020, when it all kind of came to a head. And there was, you may remember, there was an op-ed published in, I think either in the Post or the Times, I can't remember, of the UAE ambassador to the United States, and he essentially said, if annexation goes forward, then there will be no chance for any kind of normalization between Israel and Arab nations. That sort of got the ball rolling then in a different direction. It was kind of I think things had been happening behind the scenes for a little while. That was pretty obvious. But that sort of gave a kind of a public tip of the hat to what came next, which was, over the next couple of months, discussions between the U.S., Israel, and UAE, and then after that Bahrain, and after that, not long after that, Morocco and Sudan, to normalize relations with Israel. Pretty big steps, I would say, in terms of politics in the region. Probably a little less so with the UAE and Bahrain, because things had been happening already, not even that far underground. A lot of businessmen had been going back and forth. There were business ties, there were intelligence ties, but to do this as publicly as they were doing it was definitely something new. Morocco, after the Oslo Accords had been signed in 93, Morocco had established relations with Israel, and there was even an Israeli interest. I'm not sure if it was a full embassy, but certainly an Israel interest section in Morocco, as there had been in the Gulf before as well. And Morocco has a history, still has a pretty significant Jewish population. a couple of thousand, and a couple of members who are actually pretty well placed in the administration in Morocco. So there are longstanding ties between the Jewish community and Morocco. But the real interesting one, and we can talk about this more later too, is Sudan. And of course, there's the news out of Sudan isn't great right now for Sudan itself, the Sudanese people, and probably for the and maybe for the future of U.S. Sudan ties and Israeli Sudan ties. But like I said, we can touch on that later if you like. So that was that kind of, as I said, took things into a little bit of a new direction. These normalization accords, and the annexation discussion was really quickly swept off the table, thankfully. And that was really the kind of the last big hurrah, I guess I would say, of the Trump administration and of Ambassador Friedman, was getting these normalization accords across the finish line. They were certainly working on others, I think, with some other African countries and other Gulf countries. The big prize, of course, is Saudi Arabia, which you all know from following the news. Jared Kushner has a pretty tight relationship with the Crown Prince there, and I think he had been working for a long time to try to get Saudi Arabia to announce something between Israel and the Saudis, but that's not going to happen for a long time. None of I would say the accords, I think it goes without saying, the accords with the Gulf countries wouldn't have happened without Saudi acquiescence. But the Saudis aren't ready to be completely out front yet. But again, there may be other countries, like I said, some countries in Africa, some Muslim countries in Africa that are ready to go forward with these normalization accords. And there's also some talk of maybe Indonesia, Malaysia, maybe even Pakistan. So there's a lot sort of on the forefront there, that again had been started probably earlier than the summer of 2020, but it certainly became a lot more kind of frenzied and more robust during that summertime and through the fall. So that's kind of a picture of what it looked like in the last 4 years. So where are we right now? So the Biden administration, even before it came in, I think it was making these views known, but certainly once the administration was inaugurated and Secretary of State Tony Blinken came into his position, the administration made it clear that it was, again, supportive of going back to the old policy that had been followed for decades of a negotiated two-state solution, and that we were also interested in trying to get not necessarily the parties back to the table, but trying to get some confidence built up between the parties, and certainly on the Palestinian side, to build up the trust between the U.S. and Palestinians, which had essentially been shattered completely by the previous administration in a series of moves that you can only call, and I'm being pretty blunt here, but pretty humiliating. So since January, the administration has done a few things to try to restore that trust and those relations. That includes opening up the pathway to funding for Palestinian organizations. So not direct funding to the Palestinian Authority. That's probably not going to happen in any near term. We could talk about that too, but it's money that is now with USAID that will be directed to its partners and working with Palestinian NGOs. All the critical work that it had been doing, for a long time in the Palestinian Authority in those territories, in terms of, really the practical stuff, the road building, the clinics, the schools, and so on. And then we've also opened up the channel of money for UNRWA again, which we had completely cut off, and we're very vocally encouraging other countries to support UNRWA as well, since it always has a shortfall, but it has a dangerous shortfall for the rest of this year. So we're trying to get some fundraising going on that especially from the Gulf countries. And the biggest thing is that we had announced that we were going to reopen our consulate in Jerusalem, our consulate general. So essentially to pull those two pieces apart again. So that's become the most complicated piece because Israel is vehemently against that. They have said that they won't allow a consulate to the Palestinians. Essentially, what they're saying is to an entity that's not a state and have the consulate on the territory of Israel. They won't allow that. They have said, in fact, they're more than willing to let us go and open up a consulate in Ramallah, which the Palestinians don't really want, because they want the consulate to be in East Jerusalem, certainly, where they believe their capital will be eventually. And we won't do it because of security reasons, and the Israelis know that. So it's a bit of a red herring. So we haven't walked that back yet at all. We're still talking about the fact that we want to open up a consulate. We're just, I think officially what we're saying is, and we're in negotiations trying to figure out where to have that, whether it's in the old building that existed as the consulate general since 1912 on a grown road, very close to the old city, but it's in West Jerusalem, or at another site in either West Jerusalem or in East Jerusalem. So that's still to be decided upon. We did take, like I said, we didn't walk it back, but we may have sort of maybe tamped down our rhetoric a little bit on it, because of the fact that we were at the point in the springtime when the Israelis were trying to form another government after, I think, the fourth election in a row. Certainly there was a lot of talk that finally there might be another government that did not include Benjamin Netanyahu, and that we can get into those discussions about Netanyahu's relationship with the United States, and how fraught that is, especially with democratic administrations. But I think certainly I'll say this again bluntly, there was certainly some hope that there might be some fresh approaches in the Israeli government. And but I think it surprised everybody to see what exactly came out of the government formation with Bennett becoming prime minister, who's the head of a small right-wing party. I think they only came into the government with 7 seats, and one of his members did not want to join the government, refused to join the coalition. So she dropped out from the party. So that means his party only has 6 seats. So that's pretty remarkable to then be prime minister. But it was a very complicated arrangement between him and Yair Lapid, who's the foreign minister of Israel, who essentially bowed to Bennett to be prime minister first. They're going to be in a rotation, and Lapid will take it in 2 years. And he essentially agreed to that because they had all the Lapid and Bennett's party and 6 other parties had all banded together with the express goal of ensuring that Netanyahu would not be in the government, and they definitely succeeded at that. But it's a very slim majority. It's a 61 to 59 majority. And so it's going to be very difficult to get anything done that's challenging. These parties range from all the way on the left with Meretz to all the way on the right with Bennett's party, and another party called New Hope, formed by a couple of Likud breakaways. So one of the things that they did talk about is that they would pass a budget, which they just did a couple of weeks ago. That's the first time there's been a budget passed in Israel in 3 years, which makes it sound like what happens within our own Congress. But they pledged to do that, and they did that. And that was one of the reasons, like I said, that we wanted to kind of step back just a little bit in terms of the rhetoric of either a consulate or negotiations, et cetera, because we wanted to give this new government time to number one, to form itself and become strong enough to establish itself, and then to actually carry out the specific goals that it had set for itself, or at least the number one goal, which was to pass this budget. And I know that Prime Minister Bennett and Lapid and others in the government had approached the U.S., had approached the embassy and others in the State Department and the White House, asking us to do just that, to give them that breathing space. So now they passed that budget, and I saw that Bennett gave a speech not that long ago, a week or so ago after that was passed, and said something like, now I think we're ready. This government is ready to talk about the difficult things that we had put aside. So, we were able to accomplish the things that we all agreed upon: keeping Bibi out of government, passing the budget, strengthening some institutions, returning to some norms and practices that had been cast aside. That also sounds familiar to us here in the United States, and now he says he's ready to move ahead. So we'll see about that. But one of the things that he also did mention, and this goes to our discussion about U.S. foreign policy too. One of the things that Bennett talked about, and Lapid especially talked about, is restoring relations with the United States on a much more even level, meaning not just sort of relations with one party, which is essentially what it had become when Netanyahu was in power and when Trump was president. The relationship with Israel, you all have heard this before, has generally been pretty bipartisan when it comes to the United States. People on both sides of the aisle have traditionally supported Israel, whether it's through the annual military budget, or in the UN and different fora of the UN, and so forth. It's always been a pretty large bipartisan majorities. That kind of shifted when it became much more of this sort of personal relationship between Netanyahu and Trump, and all of those things that I mentioned that David Friedman was doing on the ground in Israel started to create a wedge, essentially, because you had Democratic members of Congress, and you had, especially on the progressive side, and you had members of the Jewish community on the progressive side. So there is obviously still a pretty robust Orthodox Jewish segment that's involved in politics that was supportive of that, but the larger majority of the Jewish community is on the progressive side, and we're not supporting these moves. And that's one of the things that Bennett and Lapid have talked about, is to try to get back to that practice of having the issue of Israel be much more bipartisan again. And I think I can't say it's working yet or not, but I think that you can see that they are making a real effort to do that. They both had visits to the United States already, not just to the White House and to New York, but to other parts to talk to Jewish communities. So, and one of the other things that's helping that relationship is on the religious side of things, is in Israel, religion, that anything that has to do with Judaism is controlled by the chief rabbinate. So any life cycle thing, weddings, funerals, you name it, has to get permission by the rabbinate, has to have a rabbinate approved rabbi doing these things. And the Reform congregations and the conservative congregations in Israel are essentially second-class citizens there in terms of religion, in terms of getting assistance from the government, in terms of even praying at the wall, wanting to have men and women pray together. They sort of have a small part of the wall that's not where the main plaza is, but off to the right, that they have allowed, but it's very quiet. There's no signage, etc. So again, that's one of the things that this Bennett and Lapid administration have been trying to do also, is to reach out to parts of that part of the Jewish community in the U.S., the Reform and conservative, that was pretty angry about the moves that had been made by the Prime Minister because of his alliance with the ultra Orthodox parties. And I think, like I said, you can see that their work, that they're actually really making an effort to restore that trust. So we'll see. So going forward, it's hard. I kind of alluded to it already. It's kind of hard to say, whether this government in Israel is going to survive. First of all, especially if Bennett says they're going to start tackling some of the harder issues. He didn't enumerate what those are, but certainly one of those, the elephant or whatever animal you want to ascribe it to, that's always in the room, is the conflict. And he doesn't talk about that. He hasn't talked about that. He almost never utters the word. He certainly never says Palestine. He almost never utters the word Palestinians. And he definitely hasn't talked about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We'll see if that's something that's on that agenda of difficult issues. But frankly, there isn't a lot of appetite right now in the Israeli public to tackle that issue. I wish I could say that that's not the case, but just looking at recent surveys and this is a wide swath of the public, not just on the left or the right. I'm certainly on the very far left. There is a vocal group supporting it, but pretty much a range of people, the public in Israel, would put trying to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in sort of fifth or sixth in their list of priorities. So it's just not on people's minds, certainly not the way it is day to day with Palestinians. So again, we'll see if the Israelis are willing to take that on. I think the Biden administration is going to give them a little bit more time, and won't, because of the fragility of the margin of their majority. They don't want the government to fall. It's not in our interests. It's certainly not in Israel's interest to go through another election that probably won't come to anything different. So we want to try to see this through and try to nurture it so that we can have, like I said, a more balanced relationship, a more honest relationship, a more constructive relationship, and get to the things that we really all really want to get to. So I think I've been talking for a little while. I think I'll stop there. Hopefully I have maybe given some food for thought. And like I said, I'm happy to take anything is on the table. So over to you, Barbara.
In the question and answer period, first by asking a few questions myself. I've been following this issue for about 35 years, following the news from the Holy Land. And right at the moment, there are many important aspects of our influence on the area. One I would like to bring up is fairly recent, and that is that there was a recent announcement by Israel that several Palestinian groups that provide information about what's happening on the ground are terrorist organizations because of links to an organization that promotes the downfall of Israel. However, we do know that from the Associated Press reported that Al-Haq, one of these organizations, asked frontline defenders to check phones of some of its staff for Pegasus software, and other Palestinian organizations were approached because they also had the software on their phones after it was found at Al-Haq. The charging evidence has not been shared publicly, but Israel has worked very hard to condemn these groups that provide information about what's happening in Palestine. The Irish Foreign Minister, Simon Coveney, was visiting recently, and he said he has seen no credible evidence of danger from these groups, two of which, Al-Haq and Adamir, are supported by the Irish government. We have very robust systems of knowing where our money is spent and how it is spent, Coveney explained, adding that the two groups had passed inspection by his government. This was reported in the Jerusalem Times. So this brings me to the larger question of how our government gets its information and why it persists in the policies that support the Israeli government in persecuting groups that provide information about Palestine, and also in not publicly condemning activities of the settlers that we know are going on in Palestine. So I'd like to ask you to address that.
Okay. Well, first, all right. Thanks for those questions, and I'll address first about the settler activity. I'll start with the second one first. So that is a change now that we've seen from the Trump administration, where there was complete silence when there were acts of violence, or if there was illegal building. We pretty much remain silent. We are actually a little bit more public in condemning some of these things, but there's a lot more behind the scenes too that's going on privately. And in fact, there were some recent acts of violence, I think at the end of September, that were even condemned by the Israeli government, by the foreign minister Lapid. And that's a big change as well, to have an Israeli government acknowledging that and speaking out against that. But I just want to, for the record, state that the U.S. administration and the State Department is speaking out certainly quite a bit more than it was before. On the issue of the Palestinian NGOs that were designated as arms of the PFLP, we haven't said anything in support of that. We're still waiting. I think we're still waiting to see all the information from the Israelis. Again, I'm not privy to, since I'm not part of the Middle East Bureau anymore, so I'm not privy to what exactly is going on there. But I know that the Israelis have pledged to share all their information with us, whether they have yet or not. And then I think we were going to make a final determination about what our position is about that. But I think I would say that we do have our own methods of finding out information, as you alluded to, whether on the ground there or in other places. So between those methods and between the information that we get from the Israelis, that will help us make a final determination of what our position is on that.
Thank you. I would like to open the questions to other people. I know that there are some on the chat, so I'll turn this over to Penny. Please restate the question. I'm not sure we'll see it.
Actually, I can go ahead and tackle that. Thank you. Okay, John, so it looks like I'm sure you can see these questions, but Ann Ramsey Moore asks, how does the very recent confirmation of a new ambassador to Israel impact the near future?
Okay, thanks, Ann. Yeah, the new ambassador was just confirmed recently, Tom Nines, who, and the interesting thing about him and the difference between him and the previous ambassador is that, and again, we're going back to sort of some traditions and norms that Tom Nines has experience in diplomacy. He was the deputy secretary of the State Department under Hillary Clinton for several years. So he does have experience in government. He does have experience in diplomacy with the State Department. And he's had experience in the Middle East too in his previous work. So that's I think a positive change. In terms of what kind of impact it will have, I think I feel like I keep saying this again and again, but it does need to be said. I think we're going to go back to the traditions and norms that we had before the Trump administration, before the last ambassador, David Friedman, where we have a U.S. ambassador who is there to carry out the policies of the United States government, and not necessarily to, I'm treading a little bit of a fine line here, but not necessarily to be promoting Israeli policies. I think that Ambassador Nines, because of his experience, because of the people he knows already in the region, is going to be able to do a good job in that sense. I don't think he's going to be out, out in front of things like the previous ambassador was. It'll return to much more what we saw with Ambassador Shapiro and previous ambassadors. So I'm pretty happy about the appointment. I think it's going to be it's going to herald some good things. We'll just have to, like I said in my remarks, we'll just have to wait and see exactly how things unfold with the Israeli government as it continues to go forward, and what impact that's going to have on us trying to carry out our foreign policy desires there.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. And Barbara, if it's okay, I'll take one more question from the chat, and then we'll turn it over to you if there's anyone in the sanctuary that has a question. John, I'm kind of dreading the answer to this one. Will the U.S. raise concerns about the increase in settlements? There's very little land now in Palestinian hands to become a state.
Yeah, I think we certainly have raised concerns privately. Our charge d'affaires in Israel has talked about it at the highest levels of the Israeli government. Our ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield, who's actually in the region now, I believe, has raised it with her Israeli counterpart. So we have been talking about it again, far more than we ever talked about it in the previous administration. And one interesting thing that came out recently in Israel that we hadn't seen since I can remember, actually, was there was an announcement for quite a large number of housing blocks for Israeli Jews in the West Bank, but there was also an announcement for Palestinian building, which again, in my memory, I don't remember seeing that. Now, it was significantly smaller than the Israeli Jewish side, and there needs to be a lot more, certainly, but I saw that as a positive sign, and that's something that we've talked about as well, that we'd like to see more of.
Thank you, Jonathan. Let me turn back to you, Barbara. Anyone in the sanctuary with any questions or comments? Okay.
Good morning. Thank you for coming and providing interesting introduction to a profound problem. Many years ago, when they first initiated, the U.S. government initiated programs for the West Bank, there were a series of NGOs, between 6 and 10, that actually undertook development assistance type programs, working with farmers cooperatives, education institutions that prepared children to go back into school, etc. These programs theoretically were to be monitored by the State Department, but the State Department didn't want to touch them. And so for a long time, AID had no idea what was happening until they sent a small cadre of officers out like myself to evaluate the performance. And what we found was very effective programming. They just didn't know how to program. They didn't know how to report their activities. Now, with a whole new approach that's come in with the Biden administration, and you mentioned that the staff has increased dramatically. Are there any aid officers in that staff? And in the future, are there any talks at all about humanitarian assistance, economic assistance, PL 480 assistance in the future for the populations that are on the West Bank? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for your question. That's also, I think, a positive development. I sort of alluded to it when I was talking about some of the changes with this new administration coming in terms of opening up channels of assistance. AID is definitely back. So we had a mission of about 150 people for USAID based at the embassy, but obviously working completely in the West Bank and through partners in Gaza. That was significantly downsized when we basically cut that money off completely, and went down, I think, to about a dozen or so. They kept just kind of a core, in the hopes that we would be able to return to a position where funding would restart and they could restart these programs. And that's where we are right now. I don't know the total number, but they are building back to try to restore what they had in terms of its mission size. And then with the money that they have, that was passed, I think it's about $250 million that Congress passed, that will be going to these kinds of programs that you just talked about, the kinds of programs that USAID was already administering, and that they had to cut off so precipitously back in I think it was in January 20, end of 19, beginning of 20. So it's a positive sign, and I think it's going to take a little bit of time to get it kind of restarted and then back to where it was before, but I think it's going in the right direction.
Thanks, John. Barbara, anyone else in the sanctuary that has a question currently? Okay, and also anyone on Zoom who would like to ask, just raise your hand. I can see you, or post something in the chat box. Ginny, go ahead. Let me ask you to unmute. There you go.
Yes, I know that the Palestinian government hasn't had elections in a long time. And there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of discouragement, distrust of the government, especially after the recent killing of one of the advocates, a Palestinian advocate, by Palestinian enforcers. Is the U.S. taking any effort to encourage the Palestinian government in moving forward?
In terms of having elections?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Thanks for your question. I don't follow Palestinian politics as much as I follow, as closely as I follow Israeli politics. So I'll have to be honest about that. But certainly, yeah, as you mentioned, it's well known that Abbas has now been in power for about 15 years, something along those lines, of a 4-year term. And he's tried several times to get elections, actually to administer election. The last time was, I think, this past May, that he was hoping to do it. The problem is, and again, as you pointed out, there is deep mistrust, and actually outright, vocal distaste for the Palestinian leadership by most of the public. And surveys, always show that Hamas would come in well ahead of Fatah in the elections. So, that's one of the very real reasons why Abbas keeps putting it off. And when he does put it off, he usually blames the Israeli government. I think this last time around, which he did do so again, was actually, from what I understand, was actually engineered by the Israeli government together with him. So the Israeli government essentially allowed him to say, yes, it was the Israeli government's fault, but they let him kind of climb down from that tree, so that, if they had elections, that leadership would be gone, and there would probably be Hamas members in place instead. And that's not something that will be good for the Palestinian people, and certainly not for the U.S.-Palestinian relationship. So what are we doing to encourage these institutions? I mean, certainly there's a lot of things that we have done, and we continue to do from the embassy side in terms of, programming, and, trying to build institutions. We have sent Palestinians to the United States on programs that give them the skills, to build those skills that they'll need to come back and help, build their government in a more trustworthy way. But that's it's obviously a very difficult process, and it's also fighting against a lot of history of corruption and really, people very entrenched in those positions, whether it's Abbas or others. Many of them have obviously profited from their time in government, and so they're not going to leave their positions all too willingly. So, and we've lost a lot of Palestinians, smart young Palestinians, who would probably, who are the ones that we need to continue to build those institutions and build their country, and because they've become frustrated. They can't find opportunity where they live in their land, and so they've left for other places. Because of that, I think Palestine gets into a deeper and deeper hole, unfortunately. But we'll, like I said, the programs that we have at the embassy will continue, whether it's the separate consulate or whether it's the embassy as a whole, will continue to support Palestinian public, Palestinian organizations to continue to make them stronger so that the country itself can finally stand on its feet.
Thanks, John. One more question from the chat box, and I'll turn it back over to you, Barbara. This is by a person, you may have met her once or twice. Her name is Ann Dursey. And she says, do you assess domestic political opinion in Israel toward the conflict? How do you assess domestic political opinion in Israel toward the conflict? Are younger generations' views different?
Yeah, this is not the good news story, unfortunately. Whether it's and that's what we've seen in surveys, whether it's young or old, religious or not religious, the public is the Israeli public is pretty pessimistic about any kind of real resolution to the conflict. And the fact is, and this has been going on for a long, long time, the Israeli public has learned to live with it. Most people in Israel, it doesn't touch them, directly or indirectly. Whether you're in Tel Aviv or even in Jerusalem, which is very close to the conflict, which is actually mired in the conflict in some respects. Most people just do not come into contact with it. And if it doesn't affect them personally, if it doesn't affect their lives directly, then, we see that, anywhere in any country, that people just, won't have any kind of incentive to be active about it. And that's what we see right now with the Israeli public. There just isn't, and I think I kind of alluded to this, it's pretty far down on the list of, what's most important to people in Israel. And, just like we have here in the United States, the most important things right now for the Israeli public are, the COVID situation, the health situation, and the economy. And that's what's sort of driving everything. And everything else is way down the list in terms of trying to make, any movement on it.
Thanks, John. That's actually interesting because when you think about one of the signs of privilege is not needing to address something immediately. I'm sure. For Palestinians, that's like the number one thing that they'd like to. So thank you for that. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Barbara. I'm going to asking you guys to unmute yourselves over there. Actually, there's no need for you to unmute yourself because we're coming through the system. So go ahead. Go ahead, Barbara. Kirk, I think you looks like you're going to ask a question.
Yes, I do. Thank you. Jonathan, just going back to when you kind of recounted the unilateral measures that Ambassador Friedman and the Israeli government worked out, such as U.S. recognition of sovereignty over Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, things like that. What can you say about the Israeli mindset in going along with that without having a Palestinian partner, and what that says about the two-state, the prospects for a two-state resolution of the conflict? Thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Kirk. I'd say that those couple of things that you mentioned, in particular, the Jerusalem decision and the Golan Heights, I think most people in the Israeli public, and I'm not talking about politically active people, whether on the right or the left, but sort of that sort of great middle of the Israeli public, I think is able to actually bifurcate those things. And they look at our recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and recognition of Golan Heights as sort of natural things. Of course, the Jerusalem is our capital, so why wouldn't the U.S. recognize that? Golan Heights has been ours since 1967. We have Israeli towns and cities there. We're never going to give it back to Syria. So why wouldn't the U.S. recognize that? But to them, that doesn't really necessarily mix with trying to make any progress on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It doesn't have any impact at all. And I really, again, even with Israelis that don't even think about politics or the conflict, those kinds of policies for 1 second, would probably say that. And even Israelis that never even go to Jerusalem or the Golan Heights, would probably say the same thing. Of course it's ours, so it's a no-brainer. So yeah, I wouldn't put those things together because in most Israeli minds they are completely separate. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks. We have about 4 more minutes. So Barbara, you have the microphone, I see.
Yes. We have a great deal of power over Israel because we give them so much money, and yet we don't hold them accountable. The State Department and the Defense Department have not invoked the Leahy Law at any time. Some efforts in Congress have been made, and the government doesn't speak out publicly against stealing olive oil, stealing olives, preventing Palestinians from gathering their crops, just overall stealth of land, and their government doesn't either. Is there a time when the United States is going to feel that because we give so much money, we can speak against some things that are happening there?
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't see it happening, and I would like to know why you think the United States is uncritical.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, I think I alluded to this before, that I don't want just because there aren't public condemnations happening at every step of the way doesn't mean that that's not happening behind closed doors. It is, and I can tell you for sure because I'm reading the cables from the State Department where that's describing that it's happening. So there are conversations that are happening between our leadership and the Israeli leadership about these things that is not getting out to the public. That's true, and there's a reason for that, of course. But those are conversations that were not happening in the Trump administration. So I want to be clear about that tone, that direction has changed.
But we're talking about the Biden administration. It seems to have stepped backwards. Why isn't the Biden administration more critical?
Well, okay, so that's what I'm saying. I think we have been more critical directly to the leadership. We haven't done it as much publicly, and we can debate whether that's an appropriate thing to do right now or not. I mentioned that the Biden administration decided to take, I don't want to say necessarily step back, but at least to tone things down a little bit because of the formation of that new government. Now, whether that's going to change, because now this government has been in power for 9 months or so, they're on pretty good footing. So, where are we going to go in terms of our statements? In the near term, we'll have to see. One of the things, you mentioned about holding Israel accountable and using leverage like the money that we give. There was an effort in Congress not that long ago to hold back. I think it was about $1 billion worth to replenish the Iron Dome. There were several members of Congress from the progressive wing that did not agree to that vote. It was later put in, I think, a larger budget bill. I don't think that's that is a lot of leverage. I don't think that's the kind of leverage that the Biden administration will use, because we also are pretty clear about our policy has always been, we're going to support the defense, the existence of the state of Israel. And when you talk about Iron Dome, that's saving lives, both Israeli lives and possibly Palestinian lives. If that didn't exist, there would be a larger conflict probably. So I don't think that those are the kinds of things that are going to be used. There are hopefully other things in our toolkit that we can use. And like I said, I think we'll see a little bit more of that as we get a new ambassador in place, as the Biden administration also is going through a lot of other things, on the domestic side. So just in terms of being able to prioritize, I think once things are a little bit more positive on an economic footing in the U.S. and with COVID, I think that we might be able to turn our attention a little bit more to things in the Middle East. That's my opinion. That's my sense. I also like to think positively about those things. So
thanks, John. John, you've always been so open and candid with us about all of this stuff. And I just want to end with one last question. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to get to everybody. It looks like we have a couple of, oh no, some people are just saying, thank you again. Thanks for your insights. But there's one question by Kathy and Earl O'Donnell, and we'll just end on this today. What practical things could the U.S. do to move toward peace?
Yeah, it's a great question.
That's an easy one, John. That's an easy one.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, certainly from the State Department perspective, on the ground, we need to keep, and I already mentioned about money that's already flowing to USAID, money that's in the hands of our public diplomacy officers at the embassy. These are the kinds of things that we're going to be able to use to support groups in Israel and Palestine that are directed towards engagement and communication and getting to understand each other. Those are the only things that are going to improve the conditions on the ground for a resolution. I mentioned at the top when I was giving my remarks that there were several reasons why things failed with the Kerry peace process, and one of those is the leadership. And that was both on the Israeli side and the Palestinian side. So there's new leadership now on the Israeli side. So the jury's still out there, in terms of whether they're committed to something like that, to moving forward. But on the Palestinian side, I'm not sure that it'll be easy to move forward with Abbas still in power, especially since he doesn't have the trust of his own people. But the U.S. is going to continue to, whether it's through programs and assistance, is going to continue to try to foster those conditions, between the two sides that will one day, hopefully sooner rather than later, bring the parties back to the table and get to a two-state solution, because it's really the only way for Israel and Palestine to live in dignity and to respect each other and to be secure is to have that situation. So,
John,
I hope that's a hopeful note.
Thank you. I speak on behalf of everybody here just to say how thankful we are that you joined us again. Thanks so much. And we're glad to be in relationship with you, and I hope that that we're a resource also for any thoughts or stuff that you think could make a difference on Israel-Palestine. We're here and we're ready to work. So
thank you, Sari. I appreciate that. I'll keep that in mind, and thank you to everyone for listening and engaging, and I really appreciate the relationship as well.
All right. Blessings.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's so
Thank you,
wonderful
Ann.
to see you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Great to see you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.